Imagine walking into the most luxurious wedding in town, where every guest believes you don't belong. But when a wealthy man brings a homeless black woman as his date, the entire room is stunned. No one expected her to speak, until she did, and what happened next left the bride humiliated and the world speechless. Anthony Caldwell had lived most of his adult life surrounded by success. He was the kind of man people envied, the kind who pulled up to valet entrances in sleek black cars, who wore custom suits with effortless confidence, who seemed untouchable. But behind the polished exterior, there was a weariness in his eyes that few noticed. For all his wealth and accomplishments, there were scars that money couldn't hide. His ex Claire had carved many of them. Their relationship had been built on appearances, social connections, and her obsession with status. When Anthony realized she valued prestige more than love, he walked away. Yet Claire made sure the world knew she was the one who ended things, and in the months that followed, she flaunted her new fiancé, a man just as wealthy, just as arrogant, and perhaps even more obsessed with image than she was. The wedding invite came in a thick white envelope, embossed in gold. Anthony almost laughed when he opened it. Claire hadn't invited him out of kindness. She had invited him to humiliate him, to parade her new life in front of him, to prove she had upgraded. He knew it, and still, something inside him stirred. He considered ignoring it, but a part of him, the part still bruised from her betrayal, wanted to walk into that wedding and remind her he was not the man she thought she had broken. But Anthony wasn't interested in arriving with another woman from his circle of wealth. That would be exactly what Claire expected. Another polished face, another expensive gown, another pawn in the game of appearances. He wanted to do something different, something that would strip away the illusion Claire had always lived in. And so, as he drove through the city one cool evening, the idea came to him, not in the form of a plan, but in the form of a woman sitting on the corner of Elm and Fifth, wrapped in a tattered coat with a cardboard sign resting in her lap. Her name was Maya, though Anthony didn't know it yet. To the world passing her by, she was just another homeless woman. People averted their eyes when they walked past her, as if poverty were contagious. Some tossed coins without looking. Most ignored her altogether. But Anthony slowed his car and really looked at her. She wasn't begging aggressively, wasn't shouting, wasn't even making eye contact with those who rushed past. She simply sat there, her sign handwritten in shaky letters, trying to get back on my feet. Anything helps. Something about her stillness, her quiet dignity, even in desperation, struck him. He pulled over, ignoring the impatient horns behind him, and approached her. Maya lifted her eyes, cautious but not afraid, and Anthony saw strength there, strength buried under exhaustion, but strength nonetheless. "You hungry?" he asked simply. She blinked, caught off guard. "Always," she answered with a dry laugh. He offered his hand. "Come on, let's get dinner." Maya hesitated. She had been approached before by men with pity in their eyes, or worse, men with intentions that had nothing to do with kindness. But something about Anthony's presence, the calm confidence in his voice, made her trust him enough to accept. At the restaurant, heads turned the moment they walked in. Anthony, in his tailored suit, looked every inch the wealthy businessman. Maya, in her worn coat and scuffed shoes, looked out of place among the crystal glasses and polished silverware. She noticed the stares, the whispers, but Anthony ignored them completely, treating her as if she were the only person in the room. Over steaming plates of food, Maya finally spoke. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not you?" Anthony replied. She studied him, trying to decipher his motives. He seemed genuine, but in her world, genuine was rare. Still, as the night went on, she found herself opening up. She told him about losing her job after her mother's medical bills swallowed her savings, about trying to keep her apartment before the eviction notice came, about how quickly stability had slipped through her fingers. She spoke with quiet shame, but Anthony listened without judgment. When dessert arrived, Anthony leaned back and asked a question that nearly made her laugh out loud. "What are you doing next weekend?" Maya frowned. "Trying to survive, I guess." He smiled faintly. "Would you come with me to a wedding?" She stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "A wedding? Look at me. I don't belong at weddings. I don't even belong in this restaurant." Anthony's eyes softened. "You belong anywhere you choose to be. And I'd like you to come with me." For a long time, Maya was silent. A part of her wanted to say no, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility. But another part, the part that still remembered the woman she had been before life unraveled, whispered yes. Maybe it was the way Anthony asked, not out of pity, but out of respect. Maybe it was the flicker of curiosity in her heart, the chance to step into a world that had long forgotten her. Finally, she said softly, "Okay, I'll go." Anthony smiled, but he didn't yet tell her why. He didn't explain that the wedding belonged to his ex, the woman who had measured love by status, who had thrown away their relationship in pursuit of power. He didn't reveal that this wasn't about revenge, but about truth, about showing his ex a mirror she couldn't ignore. All Anthony knew was that Maya carried something Claire never had, authenticity, and he suspected that would be more powerful than any designer gown or diamond necklace. Over the next week, Anthony arranged everything. He had a stylist prepare a dress for Maya, something elegant yet simple, something that would let her shine without disguising who she was. He booked her a spa day, not to erase her rough edges, but to remind her what dignity felt like. Maya resisted at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but slowly she allowed herself to enjoy it. For the first time in months, she saw her reflection not as a reminder of loss, but as a glimpse of possibility. The night before the wedding, she confessed her fear. "What if they laugh at me? What if I embarrass you?" Anthony shook his head. "You can't embarrass me. You'll walk in with your head high, and that's all that matters. Let them see, let them choke on their judgment." Maya breathed deeply, still uncertain but willing to trust him. Deep down, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that dignity wasn't about clothes or status, but about how she carried herself. The day of the wedding arrived, and Anthony's plan would finally unfold. As Maya stepped into the dress, smoothing the fabric nervously, she didn't look like a woman who had been forgotten by the world. She looked like a woman rediscovering herself. Anthony, seeing her, knew Claire's world of appearances was about to be shaken to its core. And as they drove toward the grand venue, Anthony glanced at Maya and thought, "This isn't about my ex anymore. This is about her. This is about reminding her, and reminding myself that dignity and worth don't come from money, but from truth." The car pulled up to the glittering venue, the kind of place dripping with chandeliers and lined with marble. Guests in designer outfits milled about, laughing, gossiping, sizing each other up. And when Anthony stepped out of the car with Maya on his arm, every head turned. The whispers began instantly. Claire's carefully constructed illusion was about to shatter, and Maya unknowingly held the hammer. The grand wedding hall glittered with chandeliers, polished marble, and the kind of extravagance that screamed wealth rather than whispered elegance. Every detail of the ceremony had been carefully planned by Claire, Anthony's ex, to display her perfect new life. The flowers were imported, the champagne French, the guest list full of socialites and business moguls. She had curated it all like a stage play designed to tell the world she had won. She was radiant in her gown, her smile practiced for cameras, her arm hooked tightly around her fiancé's. But beneath the flawless performance, Claire carried a flicker of anticipation. She knew Anthony had received the invitation, and she hoped, expected that he would come. She wanted to see the look on his face, wanted him to see what she called her upgrade. In her mind, Anthony's absence would feel like defeat, but his presence would be sweeter, a chance to remind him he'd been left behind. When the black car rolled up to the venue, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Anthony stepped out first. He was, as always, effortlessly striking in his suit, carrying himself with a calm confidence that made even the wealthiest men glance twice. But it wasn't Anthony who silenced the courtyard. It was the woman on his arm. Maya. She didn't wear the trappings of wealth in the way the other women did. Her gown was elegant but understated, chosen not to overshadow but to reveal her natural grace. Her hair framed her face beautifully, and though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her dress, her posture was upright, her chin lifted just enough to declare she wasn't afraid to be seen. And that was what unsettled them most. She wasn't afraid. The guests exchanged glances, eyes narrowing, whispers sharpened like knives. Who is she? Where did he find her? She doesn't belong here. Claire's friends, clustered near the entrance, nearly tripped over their designer heels to get a better look, their lips curling into thin smiles that dripped with mockery. They assumed Maya was a charity case, a scandal waiting to unfold. But Anthony's hand resting gently over hers as he guided her forward sent a message louder than words. She belongs here because I brought her here. Maya felt the weight of every stare, every whisper, every judgment. A week ago, she had been invisible to these kinds of people. Now their attention pressed down on her like 1,000 spotlights. Part of her wanted to retreat, to vanish back into the comfort of anonymity. But then she remembered Anthony's words from the night before. Walk in with your head high. Let them choke on their judgment. So she did. She matched Anthony's stride, forcing her shoulders back even as her heart pounded. She focused on breathing evenly, on not letting her trembling hands betray her nerves. And when she finally lifted her eyes from the floor, she caught sight of Claire standing near the altar. The bride's smile faltered. Claire's plan had been simple. Anthony would either not show up, or he would arrive with some model draped in jewels, desperate to prove his worth in her world of appearances. But this she hadn't prepared for. The woman on Anthony's arm wasn't polished in the way Claire was used to. She wasn't adorned in glittering diamonds or flashing status symbols. And yet, she radiated something Claire's circle could never buy: authenticity. Anthony's eyes met Claire's for just a moment, calm and unreadable, before he guided Maya toward their seats. Claire's fiancé, Daniel, leaned close to her ear, whispering with a smug grin, "Looks like he's scraping the bottom of the barrel now." Claire forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. She wanted to believe him, wanted to dismiss Maya as no one, but something about the way Anthony walked with her made Claire's stomach twist. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't a performance. It was genuine. As the ceremony began, Maya sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes attentive. She didn't gawk at the wealth around her or shrink under the stares. She simply observed. And with every moment that passed, the whispers grew louder, guests unable to resist sneaking glances. They expected her to falter, to do something embarrassing, to confirm their suspicion that she didn't belong. But Maya gave them nothing. Her composure was unshakable, even as her heart raced. At the reception afterward, the true test began. The ballroom filled with clinking glasses, laughter, and the hum of conversations laced with arrogance. Waiters floated between tables carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and everywhere Anthony and Maya went, eyes followed. Anthony, an older man, greeted warmly a business associate. His smile faltered just slightly when he turned to Maya. And this must be... Anthony didn't hesitate. "This is Maya." His tone was confident, not defensive, leaving no room for doubt. Maya extended her hand politely. "It's nice to meet you." The man shook her hand, clearly unsure what to make of her, but Anthony's certainty forced him to respond with respect. And so it went, table after table, introduction after introduction. Anthony never explained who Maya was, never offered a backstory to satisfy their curiosity. His unspoken message was clear. She doesn't need a title. She is enough as she is. But the questions still came in whispers. Where's she from? Is she new money? I've never seen her before. Claire's friends speculated wildly, inventing backgrounds for Maya that ranged from scandalous to absurd. But none of them could shake the discomfort of realizing Anthony didn't care what they thought. When it came time for speeches, Anthony was invited to speak. He stood, glass in hand, and the room hushed. Claire watched him closely, bracing for him to stumble or expose some vulnerability she could savor. But Anthony's words were smooth, gracious, even kind. To Claire and Daniel, he began, raising his glass. "I wish you happiness. May your lives together be filled with the things that truly matter, trust, kindness, and love." The room applauded politely, but Claire's smile tightened. She knew Anthony's words weren't flattery. They were a reminder of what she had always lacked. As Anthony sat, Maya turned to him and whispered, "That was kind." He smiled faintly. Sometimes kindness is the sharpest blade. It wasn't until later, when guests were mingling, that the moment arrived which no one would forget. Claire approached Anthony and Maya, her expression poised, but her eyes sharp. "Anthony," she greeted sweetly, her gaze flicking over Maya with thinly veiled disdain. "And you must be Maya, was it?" Maya nodded politely. "Yes, it's nice to meet you." Claire's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Anthony has always been generous. I'm sure he's been very kind to you." The implication dripped with condescension, and a few of her friends nearby stifled laughs. For a moment, Maya felt the sting of her words, the heat of humiliation threatening to rise. But then she remembered the countless times she'd been ignored, dismissed, forgotten. This moment was no different, except now she wasn't alone. She met Claire's gaze steadily. "He has been kind. But more than that, he's been respectful. That's rarer than kindness, don't you think?" The laughter around them died instantly. Claire blinked, caught off guard, her polished composure slipping for just a second. Anthony hid a smile behind his glass, pride shining in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was enough. The music swelled as the reception unfolded into full celebration. Laughter bounced off the ballroom walls, glasses clinked in rhythm with toasts, and the dance floor filled with people eager to flaunt themselves. The air smelled of champagne and roses, but beneath the sweet fragrance lingered something sharper, tension. It followed Maya like a shadow, the weight of constant eyes pressing down, judging, measuring, doubting. Anthony noticed it too. He remained calm, his hand steady on hers, his presence protective without being overbearing. But Maya was no stranger to being scrutinized. She had lived most of her recent years under the merciless gaze of society, the turned heads of strangers who dismissed her as invisible, the cold stares of store managers who treated her as a threat, the pitying glances of people who tossed her coins without acknowledgement. What was different tonight was that she wasn't standing alone. She had Anthony beside her, and for the first time in years, she felt like she had permission to look people in the eye and not flinch. As waiters circled with trays of hors d'oeuvres, Maya kept her composure. She accepted a glass of champagne, thanked the server, and sipped slowly. But as she glanced across the hall, she caught the stares, Claire's closest friends huddled together, laughing into their hands, their eyes darting toward her. Every giggle was a dagger, every whisper another attempt to strip her dignity. She told herself to ignore it. She had promised herself she would not let them see her falter. But then One of them, a woman in a glittering silver gown, leaned closer to Claire and said just loud enough, "She looks like Charity." The laughter that followed burned in Maya's ears. Anthony stiffened beside her, his jaw tightening. He leaned toward her and whispered, "We can leave any time you want." But Maya shook her head. Something in her heart, something she hadn't felt in years, surged to the surface. It wasn't anger. It was courage. She had spent too long being invisible, too long shrinking to make others comfortable. Tonight, for once, she wanted to be seen, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a person. So when the master of ceremonies announced the open microphone for toasts, Maya surprised everyone, including Anthony, by standing up. Anthony blinked. "Maya," he said softly, his tone half question, half warning. She gave him a small smile. "Trust me." The room hushed as Maya stepped forward, her gown flowing around her ankles. The stares multiplied. Curiosity now mingled with disbelief. Guests whispered to one another, "Who is she to speak? She's not family. Does Claire even know her?" Claire herself stiffened, her perfect smile freezing on her face as she watched Maya approach the microphone. Maya's fingers trembled as she took the mic, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Good evening," she began, her tone warm yet commanding. "I know I'm not the expected face you thought you'd see standing here tonight. Many of you don't know who I am. Some of you have already made up your minds about me, and that's fine. But I want to share something, not about myself, but about love." The room stilled. Maya continued, her eyes scanning the sea of polished suits and sparkling gowns. "I don't have much. I don't own mansions or drive expensive cars. I don't belong to the circles of power and wealth most of you were born into. What I do have are experiences that taught me what love is and what love is not. And since we're here tonight to celebrate love, I thought maybe my voice could add something." A ripple of unease ran through the crowd. No one expected this. Claire's fiancé, Daniel, shifted uncomfortably, whispering something under his breath. But Maya pressed on. "Love," she said softly, "is not about appearances. It is not about the dress you wear, the table you sit at, or the name you carry. Love is not about who looks best in photographs or who wins the approval of a crowd. Love is about sacrifice. It's about patience. It's about lifting someone up when they fall, not stepping on them because it makes you look taller. Love is what I saw in a mother who gave everything she had to keep her child alive, even when it cost her everything. Love is what I've seen in strangers who had little to give, but gave it anyway. And love is respect." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. Respect. It was a word that cut sharper than any insult. When you strip someone of respect, she continued, her voice now firm, you strip them of their dignity. And without dignity, there can be no love, only control, only pride, only illusion. So as we raise our glasses tonight, I hope we remember that love without respect is just a performance. And performances, no matter how beautiful, always end when the curtain falls. The silence in the room was deafening. Maya lowered the microphone gently, her hand no longer trembling. She smiled faintly, not at the crowd, but at Anthony, whose eyes shone with pride. The applause came slowly at first. 1, 2, then more. But soon the ballroom was filled with the sound of clapping, not polite or forced, but genuine. Guests who had sneered at her earlier now looked at her with a new kind of respect. For in that moment, Maya had done what no one else dared. She had pierced the illusion, spoken truth into a room built on appearances. Claire sat frozen, her smile cracking at the edges. Daniel leaned close to her, muttering angrily, "Why would you let her speak?" But Claire had no answer. She didn't let Maya speak. Maya had taken her place at the microphone, and in doing so, she had shifted the power in the room. Anthony rose as Maya returned to their table. He didn't need to say anything. The way he took her hand said it all. He hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for it, but he knew in his heart that Maya's courage had just rewritten the night. But the story wasn't finished. The whispers that followed were no longer mocking. They were filled with awe. Who is she? She speaks with such strength. She's more graceful than half the women here. And though Claire tried to reclaim control, tried to dazzle with her gown and her orchestrated perfection, she couldn't silence what Maya had planted in their minds. For the first time in Claire's carefully curated world, someone had walked in without money, without status, and left an imprint that couldn't be erased. Later that night, as the band played and couples filled the dance floor, Anthony and Maya sat together, a quiet island in the storm of noise. He leaned closer, his voice low but filled with admiration. "Do you know what you just did?" Maya smiled faintly. "I spoke the truth." "Yes," Anthony said, his eyes warm. "But more than that, you changed the room. And I don't think Claire will ever forget it." Maya didn't reply. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as someone to be pitied, not as someone to be judged, but as someone who mattered. And as the night wore on, the true weight of what she had done began to settle. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had reminded everyone, including Anthony, what real worth looked like. The performance Claire had orchestrated so carefully was cracking. The spotlight no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the woman she thought would be her humiliation. And the best part? Maya didn't even realize how much more she was about to change. The band played louder now, as if trying to drown out the shift in atmosphere that Maya had left behind. The dance floor filled with elegant couples, spinning in rehearsed patterns of wealth and vanity. But the energy in the room wasn't the same. Maya's words lingered in the air like smoke, truth too sharp to ignore, too heavy to dismiss. Anthony felt it too. Sitting beside her, he watched the ripples spread through the crowd. People who had barely glanced at Maya before now eyed her with curiosity, some even admiration. They whispered not about her gown or her background, but about her composure, her strength, her words. For a woman the room had decided didn't belong, Maya had somehow become the center of it. Claire, however, was seething. She had spent months crafting this event, hiring the best planners, picking out every flower, rehearsing every moment so that nothing could go wrong. And yet here was Maya, this unknown woman, this guest she hadn't approved, standing up and delivering a speech that had stolen her thunder. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Claire's wedding was meant to be a showcase, a crowning jewel to display her perfect life. Now people were whispering about someone else. Daniel, her fiancé, leaned close to her ear, his voice a low growl. "Control this. She's making us look like fools." Claire forced a smile as cameras flashed, her cheeks burning. She knew she had to act, to reclaim the spotlight before it slipped too far. So when she saw Maya and Anthony step toward the refreshment table, she seized her chance. "Anthony," she called sweetly, gliding across the floor in her gown. Her voice carried like silk laced with venom. "So wonderful to see you again." And Maya, wasn't it? She extended her hand, her smile all polished charm. Maya shook it politely, though she felt the coldness beneath the gesture. "Yes, it's a pleasure." Claire tilted her head, her eyes glinting with mock innocence. "I must say, your words earlier were unexpected. Very moving, really. You have quite a talent for speaking." There was a pause, and then Claire added softly, but just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "It's almost hard to believe someone without refinement could speak so eloquently." The sting was subtle but sharp, a veiled insult, delivered under the guise of a compliment. Some of Claire's friends snickered, covering their mouths with manicured hands. Anthony opened his mouth to respond, but Maya beat him to it. Her voice remained calm, her smile gentle. Sometimes refinement is mistaken for rehearsed manners. I think real grace comes from truth. Don't you? The air around them tightened. Claire's smile faltered just for a moment before she quickly recovered. But it was too late. Her attempt to undermine Maya had backfired. The guests around them looked at Maya with new respect, and Claire with thinly veiled discomfort. Anthony's chest swelled with quiet pride. This wasn't the timid woman he had found on a street corner weeks ago. This was someone who carried herself with unshakable dignity, someone who had learned that power doesn't come from wealth, but from refusing to bow. But the evening wasn't done unraveling Claire's world. Later, as the waiters began clearing plates and the band played softer songs, one of Claire's older relatives, a woman with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, pulled Anthony aside. She had always liked him, though she would never say it aloud. "That woman you brought," she said in a low tone, nodding toward Maya, "she has more presence than half the people here. Reminds me of your mother." Anthony smiled. "That's the highest compliment you could give her." The woman's gaze shifted toward Claire. "I wish I could say the same for the bride. But mark my words, truth has a way of catching up. And that young lady you brought tonight, she may be the spark." Anthony frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" The woman only patted his arm. "Just watch." And soon Anthony understood. As the evening dragged on, whispers began to spread, not about Maya this time, but about Claire. A waiter, perhaps emboldened by champagne, muttered something about unpaid invoices. A florist complained quietly to another guest about promises of late payments. And then, like cracks in a dam, the stories began to flow. Claire had overspent. She had leaned heavily on credit, making promises of future funds that didn't quite exist. The lavish wedding wasn't built on stability, it was built on debt. And in the shadow of Maya's speech about authenticity, the contrast couldn't have been more glaring. Maya herself hadn't sought to expose Claire. She hadn't come with that intention, but her presence, her truth, her reminder of what really mattered, made the illusion of Claire's perfection brittle. People started to see the cracks, started to question the shine. The moment came to a head when Daniel's business partner, a stern man with little tolerance for deception, cornered him near the bar. "I hear you're covering Claire's debts with company funds," he said bluntly. "Is that true?" Daniel flushed red. Of course not. But the partner wasn't convinced, and as others overheard, the murmurs grew louder. Claire, desperate, turned her frustration toward the easiest target. She approached Maya once more, her mask slipping this time. "I don't know what game you're playing," she hissed quietly, her smile gone. "But this isn't your place. You don't belong here." Maya looked at her calmly, her voice soft but steady. "You're right. This isn't my world. But belonging isn't about wealth, Claire. It's about being true. And right now, this doesn't look much like truth." The words struck harder than Maya intended, but they were undeniable. For the first time all night, Claire looked genuinely shaken. Her eyes darted around the room, catching the whispers, the suspicious glances, the doubt spreading like wildfire. Her perfect stage was collapsing, and she couldn't control it. Anthony stepped closer, his hand on Maya's shoulder. "You don't need to prove anything," he murmured. But Maya shook her head slightly. "I'm not proving anything. I'm just refusing to shrink." It was then Anthony realized this wasn't about revenge, and it never had been. Maya wasn't there to hurt Claire, nor to expose her lies. She was simply living her truth, and somehow that truth was more powerful than all the wealth in the room. The night ended not with Claire basking in her victory, but with murmurs of doubt trailing after her like smoke. Guests left with polite smiles but whispered questions. And through it all, Maya walked beside Anthony with her head high, Not because of the gown she wore or the arm she held, but because she had discovered something she thought she'd lost forever: her dignity. Anthony, driving her home later, glanced at her in the dim glow of the city lights. "You realize what you did tonight, don't you?" Maya shook her head. "I just spoke." Anthony smiled softly. "No, you reminded them what real worth looks like. And you reminded me too." For a long moment, silence filled the car. Then Maya whispered, almost to herself, "I think I needed tonight more than you did." Anthony's chest tightened. She was right. What had begun as his attempt to make a point to his ex had become something else entirely. It had become Maya's night, a night where she reclaimed her voice, her strength, her place in the world. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The night ended the way most weddings do: music softening, tables littered with empty glasses and half-eaten desserts, guests leaving with smiles painted on for photographs, but whispers curled sharp behind them. Yet this night was different. Claire had wanted it to be her grand statement, a spectacle proving her superiority. Instead, it had become something else entirely. And though the chandeliers still sparkled and the champagne still flowed, the illusion she had worked so hard to build had cracked under the weight of truth. As Anthony guided Maya through the glittering exit, the contrast between the two of them and the remaining guests could not have been more clear. They weren't draped in the same pretense, nor trapped in the same obsession with appearances. They were simply themselves. For Maya, it was both surreal and freeing. Just weeks earlier, she had been invisible on a city street corner. Now she had walked into a ballroom filled with the most powerful and judgmental people she could imagine, and walked out with her dignity not only intact, but shining brighter than before. Anthony opened the car door for her, his gesture as natural as breathing. As they slid into the quiet interior, Maya let out a shaky laugh. "Well," she said softly, "I don't think I'll ever get invited to another wedding like that again." Anthony chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think anyone will ever forget you were at this one." For a moment, silence filled the car as the city lights blurred past the windows. Then Anthony spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "You know, when I first asked you to come, I thought it would just be a way to make a point, to show Claire that her world wasn't the only one that mattered. But tonight," he trailed off, searching for the right words, "tonight wasn't about her. It was about you." Maya turned her head, meeting his eyes. There was no arrogance in his voice, no condescension, only truth. "I don't know what came over me," she admitted. I was tired of being invisible, tired of letting people decide my worth. When I spoke tonight, I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to myself." Anthony's chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years: respect, admiration, hope. They drove in silence for a while longer, but Maya's thoughts were restless. She replayed the night in her mind: the stares, the whispers, Claire's attempts to belittle her, and her own decision to rise above it. She had walked into that ballroom expecting to be out of place. Instead, she had discovered that authenticity could disarm even the sharpest cruelty. And yet, even as pride stirred in her chest, doubt lingered. She wasn't blind. She knew the stares hadn't vanished entirely. Some people would never accept her, no matter how she carried herself. She would still return to her struggles tomorrow. The dress would come off, the hair would loosen, and the weight of survival would sit back on her shoulders. But something inside her had shifted. Tonight, she hadn't been defined by her circumstances. She had been defined by her courage. Back at her small temporary shelter, Anthony walked her to the door. For a moment, they stood in the cool night air, neither wanting the evening to end. "Thank you," Maya whispered, her voice catching. "Not just for tonight. For seeing me." Anthony's eyes softened. "You've always been worth seeing. Don't forget that." They parted with a quiet goodbye, but neither of them truly returned to who they had been before that night. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the wedding spread quickly. The whispers about Maya transformed into stories. Guests who had mocked her found themselves retelling the evening with reluctant admiration. She spoke with such dignity. One said, "She carried herself better than most of us." Another admitted. Soon, her presence became legend, a reminder that wealth without respect meant nothing. But while Maya's memory grew brighter, Claire's shine dimmed. The cracks exposed that night widened quickly. Business partners questioned her fiancé's finances. Relatives whispered about debts that couldn't be ignored. The image Claire had tried so desperately to maintain began to unravel, and though she smiled for cameras and tried to pretend nothing was wrong, behind closed doors she was furious, not only at the whispers, but at the woman who had stolen her spotlight without even trying. Yet the truth was, Maya hadn't stolen anything. She had simply been herself. And in a world built on illusion, truth was powerful enough to topple castles made of glass. For Maya, life didn't magically transform overnight. She still woke up each morning with the same challenges, finding stability, piecing her life back together, facing the uncertainty of tomorrow. But something was different now. She no longer saw herself as invisible. She no longer carried the shame that had weighed her down. Instead, she carried a quiet pride, a knowledge that dignity couldn't be stripped from her unless she surrendered it. Anthony kept in touch, offering help not out of pity, but out of genuine respect. He connected her with people who could assist, gave her opportunities to regain her footing, but always with her consent, never forcing her hand. Maya accepted some help and declined others, determined to rebuild her life on her own terms. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had choices. One evening, weeks later, she and Anthony met for coffee at a small cafe far from the glittering venues of wealth. They sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Do you ever think about that night?" Anthony asked quietly. Maya smiled, faintly. "Every day, not because of the people, or the stairs, or even Claire, but because of how I felt. I walked in terrified, and I walked out taller. I think I needed to remember what that felt like." Anthony nodded slowly. "You didn't just remind yourself. You reminded me too. That money, power, all of it, it's meaningless without respect." They fell into silence again, but it was a comfortable silence, one filled with unspoken understanding. For both of them, the wedding hadn't been an ending, it had been a beginning. Months later, Claire's marriage was already faltering. Rumors of financial strain circulated, and her once perfect facade no longer dazzled as it had before. She had built her world on appearances, but appearances were fragile, and when they shattered, there was nothing left to hold them together. Maya, on the other hand, was slowly rebuilding. With Anthony's encouragement and her own determination, she found steady work, saved for a modest apartment, and began piecing her life back together. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, but she had something far more valuable: self-respect. And every so often, when doubt crept back in, she remembered that night. For Claire, the wedding had been the performance of a lifetime. For Maya, it had been the rebirth of her spirit. And for Anthony, it had been the moment he realized that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones the world tries hardest to ignore. By the time the story of that night faded from society's gossip and became nothing more than a memory, its impact still lingered, not in the whispers of the wealthy, but in the quiet strength Maya carried with her. Because in the end, she hadn't just survived the judgment of the rich. She had conquered it, not with wealth, not with power, but with the one thing they couldn't take from her: her truth. And that truth, once found, could never again be forgotten.